let's kick off. Kia ora koutou, ko Sylvie tōku ingoa. Nice to see you all on what in Auckland certainly is a thundery, weather warning, blustery, wet afternoon. I hope the weather is much less dramatic where you are all around the country. So thank you for joining us today for our session on organisational design. I'm just going to jump in and share my screen with you all, and if you could just give me a heads up in the Q&A or the chat if the screen share is working for you, that would be fantastic. So I'm just going to pull this along. Cool. And that should now be coming through for you. So again, today's session is on organisational design. We're going to be talking about getting the right people in the right place at the right time. And before we kick off, as usual, just a little bit of housekeeping. So before we begin, this session is being recorded. So if you'd like to access a copy of the recording after the session, you're very welcome to do so. If you have to duck away and take a call, or if the audio craps out for whatever reason, be aware that there will be a recording for you later on. Of course, please keep today's discussions confidential. So there will be examples that I'm using today, which I have certainly anonymised, but I'm using data from real-world examples where I've worked with clients on these issues. I'd prefer not to see that splashed all over TikTok or Instagram, so if you do have any questions, you're welcome to ask them, but again, just keep the conversations today confidential. Questions are welcome, of course. I always say that these sessions come alive when there's a lot of audience engagement, so if there's anything that you'd like to check in or anything you'd like me to speak more about, please let me know as we go through, and there's the Q&A function that you can access as we go through where you can ask questions anonymously or otherwise. So what would be really useful to me before we kick off today is to understand a little bit about what you are looking to get out of the session today. So if you'd like to jump into the Q&A and share perhaps your name, where you're joining us from around the motu, and also if there's something in particular that drew you to sign up to this webinar today so that I can understand your context, but also share examples that are more relevant to what you want to learn, that would be great. So I'll take a second to let some of those come through. Cool, no questions. Everyone's joining today for the fun of it and to have something to do on a wet and windy Wednesday. I totally understand. So let's get into the content today. So in terms of what to expect, the first thing we'll talk about a little bit is who MyHR is. If you haven't seen our material before or haven't heard of us before, I want to make sure you understand why we're talking about organisational design and why we are in a pretty good position to do so. I'll then speak briefly about the headwinds that we're facing and the context of the conversation about organisational design. We'll describe what it is, of course. We'll go through a series of green and red flags to give you a sense if the organisational design in your workplace is on the right track or might need some attention. We'll then go into a bit of detail talking about the STRAT methodology and also show you some examples of that in action so you can get a sense of what it is that I'm talking about. I'll wrap up by sharing the bonus resources that will be available to you following this session, have time for questions as I flagged earlier, and then we should get you out of here at about 10 to 2. So I've had some comments come through in the Q&A. Paddy is joining from Wellington. Kia ora, Paddy, thank you for joining us today. He's interested in learning more about the flags that organisational structure may be suboptimal. Perfect, that's exactly what we'll cover off a bit later on. Pam says hello from a freezing Wellington. Kia ora, Pam, I'm sorry it's cold down your way. I think it's about 10 degrees up here, so we might have you beat on the temperature front. Pam is keen to just understand that growing staff numbers need to be carefully thought out. What outputs do we want to achieve from just increasing new roles? Exactly. And those types of growth questions are exactly some of the examples that we'll run through, as well as giving you some food for thought around the questions you should be asking when you're making changes in your organisation. Last one here, Heidi. Kia ora, Heidi is joining us from Wellington again from Zesty Business Support Services. Welcome. She's keen to hear about the signs needed to review your organisational structure. Perfect, and that's one of the things that we'll cover off today. So thank you, Paddy, Pam, and Heidi for sharing what you're interested in hearing about and where you're joining from. So let's crack into it, and we'll start off by talking about who MyHR is. So we were established in 2013. We're a New Zealand owned and operated company, and we're here to make HR easy. What we do is we are outsourced HR covering all employment matters. So our co-founders, Sean and Jason, were a small business owner and an HR expert respectively. And when they were having a surf together in Piha one day, Sean was feeling frustrated about how hard it was to find good HR support for small businesses. He was running a small design and print organisation at the time. And the choices really were hire an in-house person, which was crazy. He had a staff of 10. He didn't need an $80,000 HR resource, or get a lawyer or an advocate involved, and they would be charging crazy amounts of money per hour to help with what was a reasonably straightforward matter. So MyHR was born. We took Sean's business knowledge and Jason's understanding of delivering high volume, effective, pragmatic HR support at scale from his time at Woolworths in Australia, from what was Dick Smith Electronics, from Henkel Manufacturing, and from Sky City, and MyHR was born. So we're a bit unusual in that we combine expert HR support with smart HR software. So in the background are a bunch of HR people like me, some taller, some shorter, with a range of backgrounds, here to provide pragmatic, useful HR guidance to our clients. And the way that we do that at scale, at the price point that we do, is that we have a platform that is the interface between our clients and ourselves. So not only is it the HRIS one-stop shop for HR truth with our clients, it's where they store their employee records, their policies, it's where performance reviews, it's where their integrations with payroll and with ATS systems live, but it's also the bridge between our clients and ourselves. And so we pair the power of software with the HR experts to make sure that you're not just being given keys to a Ferrari that you don't know how to drive. We're here to help solve HR problems for you, as well as help you take advantage of the streamlining and automation that a platform can offer. We now support 1,500 employers in New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. We launched in Canada a couple of months ago, which is incredibly exciting to be adding a third country to the territories that we support. Our New Zealand clients are supported out of New Zealand, Australian clients are supported out of Australia, and so on. So you're talking to people in your country who understand the context. And our clients really run the gamut across all industries and all sizes. So our smallest employer has one employee. He's very keen. He likes to cross his T's and dot his I's. And our largest is Resine Paints, with sitting up around that 800 number of employees. And again, we cover all industries. So retail, manufacturing, accommodation and hospitality, distribution, professional services, you name it, we probably have a client who does similar work. And what this means is we come across a massive range of HR and ER issues that we can provide support with. There's not a lot that we haven't seen. And again, it means that our team are very well placed to support you with whatever people challenges or opportunities you're taking advantage of. Just one last comment on pricing and the way the business model works. We don't have lock-in contracts. The onus is on us to provide a really excellent service. And because we charge based on headcount, not on usage, you might call us 20 times in May with a bunch of questions. Maybe you've got 3 new people joining your business. One of your colleagues has, dealing with a mental health issue, and so you need some support guiding them on that. And then maybe in June, you might call us once with a question about the Matariki public holiday in New Zealand. Your cost doesn't change. It's smoothed over those months. Again, because we charge based on headcount, not on usage. We very much want to be the fence at the top of the cliff. And if we were billing you every 6 minutes, it makes it less likely that you're going to get in touch with us. So having kept my sales and marketing team happy by talking about who we are and what we do, let's jump into today's content. And the first thing to do is to talk about the headwinds and the context that we are operating in. So when we talk about organisational design, it's true that it shows up in all stages of company growth in all areas. But when we're in a challenging economic environment, typically we end up having these conversations when you're dealing with challenges or you're dealing with changes in your business. So the first thing to name is that we are managing pretty low consumer confidence in New Zealand at the moment. It's sitting at 84.9 from the ANZ Roy Morgan survey, with a historical average above 110. So it is up slightly on April, but we're still seeing very, very low consumer confidence, and that is certainly flowing through into spending in retail, hospitality, and the construction industry, as many of us are aware of. At the same time, we're facing increased labour costs. So I work in this area. I talk about pay and about wages pretty frequently. And I was surprised when I ran the numbers to see that the minimum wage has increased 47% in 7 years, from 2017 to 2024. So it's not always true that a rising tide lifts all boats. If you've got someone in your business earning $100,000 a year, increases to the minimum wage aren't massively likely to affect what remuneration they're looking for. But certainly where you've got people who are maybe $1.50 or $2 an hour away from their minimum wage colleagues, when the minimum wage crew get an increase, there's kind of this inflationary effect that lifts what people expect from their remuneration. That's exacerbated by the cost of living that we're all experiencing too. So the rate of increase is dropping. It's currently sitting at about a 4% consumer price index increase. That was for the March 2024 year. So between March 2023 and March 2024, the cost of consumer goods rose about 4%. Again, that is slowing, but over the last year, we have seen some incredibly high numbers for the increase of cost of living. And so that's driving pressure on wages as well, as people are expecting more money to kind of get through. Unemployment, there's a little bit of, double-edged sword news here for employers. It rose slightly to 4.3% for the March 24 quarter, so Jan, Feb, March of this year, which means that there are more people looking for work than there have been previously, which means it's going to be easier to find the warm bodies to come and do the work in your organisation. This is reflecting in the underutilisation rate as well. It's 11.2% for the March 24 quarter. The underutilisation rate reflects people who are not working as much as they would like to potentially, whether that's maybe they're doing a 20-hour-a-week job and they would like to be working 30 or 40 hours. And this is up slightly from the previous quarter where I believe it was 10.7%. So more people around, more people who aren't being used to their maximum capacity means it is a bit easier for employers to be finding skills and to be finding candidates at the moment. So a slightly more difficult market for job seekers and a slightly better market for employers who are looking for candidates. One last point I like to mention here is that our population demographics are changing too. So unlike the acute pressures that these other factors are putting on businesses right now, there are some longer term trends that it's useful to be aware of, even if you don't need to respond to them next week. So in New Zealand at the moment, we have 4 workers aged under 65 for every 1 worker aged over 65. Of course, 65 is the rate that superannuation kicks in. So we have a lot of data about workers on either side of that point. I'm not just picking on people aged 65. But what we know is that in 20 years, that's going to change to being 2 people aged under 65 in the workforce for every 1 person over. So to go from a 4-to-1 ratio to a 2-to-1 ratio means that there are going to be far more people over 65 in the workforce looking for work, getting paid and just kind of doing work. Now, if you have a business that relies heavily on manual labor, that relies heavily on anything to do with fitness or strength or stamina, that's going to be something you might want to keep an eye on, as again, that pool of workers under 65 is going to be much smaller proportion to the pool of people over 65. Not something to deal with right now, but certainly something to be aware of in the long term. So in that context, we can see that businesses are facing kind of low spending, certainly on the retail side of things, increasing labour costs also being driven by people wanting more money for the job because they just need more money to pay the mortgage and put food on the table. But it's slightly improved candidate market in terms of who's coming through and who you might be choosing to hire from. So when we talk about org design and organisational design, what we're talking about is the process of designing the job structure of your organisation and the tasks and responsibilities of those jobs. Clearly, this matters when we are experiencing pressure in the private sector because we are going to be making changes to accommodate for and respond to the conditions that we're operating in. Importantly, org design happens whether you pay attention to it or not. Every time you make a decision about hiring or you make a decision about which tasks to give to which person in your organisation, that is a choice about the design of your organisation and the design of the work that sits within it. Again, it's relevant at all sizes and stages, whether you're a small business, whether you're medium, whether you're a large corporate. Who does what work and what work is done are choices that matter and are critical at every size of business. And in a smaller operation, it's really important because one person might be 20% of your workforce or 10% of your workforce. So making sure that they are doing the right work is really critical because otherwise you're losing kind of 10% of your productivity. In a larger entity or a larger enterprise, it's also critical because if you have 100 people working on something that's not important, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars that you're spending on a process or a task or a priority that doesn't contribute to your strategic outcomes. And again, whether you're downsizing, whether you're stable, whether you're growing, you are making choices about who does what work and how you arrange and organize that work that matter in terms of achieving your goals. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about org design. I'm hoping to bring it to life with examples during this webinar. It's one of my favorite HR processes, and that I find it quite engaging and quite stimulating, particularly as it connects to the strategy and the goals of the business, but it can sound quite dry. So if there is anything in here that you would like me to speak to more, or that you'd like me to go into more detail on, please let me know, because if you come away from this feeling more interested and more engaged in the topic, I will have done my job and this will have been a successful afternoon for me. So a couple of the questions that came through were about green flags and red flags. So let's get into that now. So some signs that your org design are going well, start with progress is being made towards your strategic objectives, whether that's growing your revenue, whether that's launching a new product, maybe that's entering into a new market. If you are making progress towards these big strategic goals, your org design is probably well set up to support that because you are seeing progress made. Likewise, if we get down into more of the operations and more of the weeds, if what needs to get done is getting done, that's a sign that your org design is working well, because again, you're making progress on what's critical on a day-to-day basis. From a people perspective, if there are clear internal expectations and areas of responsibility, Sylvie knows what she's working on, Ashley knows what she's working on, Lisa knows what she's working on. Again, it's a sign that your structure is supporting what your people need to know to make progress on what's sitting in front of them. When recruitment is straightforward, you know the skills and capabilities you're going to market for, you know what work you're going to be assigning them. It's reasonably easy to find candidates because you're not looking for, one person to master 7 different functions. It's pretty clear that they have a skill set that is reasonable to expect one person to have. Again, a positive sign. Where workload in your team is generally reasonable, with some peaks and troughs. We can't ever get it perfectly right. But if generally the workload is manageable and no one's burning out or taking a lot of time off on stress, on sick leave, or taking time off for personal reasons, again, a signal that you've got the right number of doers for the work that's required. This is a more subtle one. When your org design is set up effectively, it's a lot easier to confidently manage behavioural or performance issues because there are clear deliverables, clear expectations, and often those deliverables and expectations are managed pretty clearly and pretty reasonably within the framework that you have. So if your org design is set up well, if your organisation is structured sensibly, most of the time it will be easier to manage behavioural or performance issues because you have those clear expectations, and also you're not being held hostage to someone who is a unicorn candidate with the skills that you need to do this really weird job that you've created, and you're not worried about pissing them off or making them leave the business because you'd be worried it would be impossible to find someone else with this unicorn set of skills. Last sign that I'll just flag here is that if your expenditure on temps and contractors is reasonable, again, a sign that your org design is working well for you. So what's reasonable depends quite a lot on the business. I can't give you a figure here, but if you're spending, half your salary on your wages budget on temps and contractors, in most circumstances that would be alarming. Typically anything from sort of 5 to 15%, again, depending on context, is sensible, but spending too much, unless again you're a labour hire business where that's sort of your business model, so that makes sense. If your spend is reasonable and you can get the resources you need when you need them, a sign that the setup of your job structure is working well and might not need too much attention. We lead now into the red flags, and some of the things that came up for Patty and Pam earlier were just understanding some of the reasons that your red flags might not be, your org design might need some attention. So the first one we'll kick off with is that strategic progress is slow or non-existent. If you can just never get out of the weeds of what it is that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, to pay attention to those big rocks that make up your big projects or your big priorities, that's a sign that you probably don't have enough doers in the business to get to where you need to go, and the way that you've allocated your resourcing may need some attention. Likewise, if there are unclear internal expectations, perhaps you've got a bunch of overlap, maybe Sylvie and Ashley clash on who's responsible for a particular function because it's not really obvious who should be there. When you get people kind of territory protecting or patch protecting because they're a bit worried that if something changed, they would lose their work and what they're responsible for, it's a sign that your structure isn't that clear and potentially may need some work and attention to clarify which function's responsible for what, who looks after what work, and what resources are available to manage the workloads from those different functions. This is a bit of a vague one, but where you're experiencing really high reactivity and low responsiveness, that can be a sign that you don't have enough thinkers or planners to kind of forecast risk, flag what might be coming through the pipeline, whether that's changes to the markets that you operate in, whether it's legislative changes that are going to make things more difficult for you, whether it's regulation and policy changes that are going to impact how you work, whether it's just not having a good read on your team and maybe having a lot of individuals who are quite a high flight risk, but not really having the time or the headspace to pay attention to that. And so you have to keep reacting to quite a lot of turnover in your teams and your business. Where there is that level of reactivity and not a lot of responsiveness and planning and thinking, again, a sign that you maybe don't have your resources allocated in a way that's most effective. This can show up too where your workloads are too unbalanced. So if you have 100% of your attention and time being consumed by the business as usual in the day-to-day, you are going to miss things at that more tactical or strategical level that would have made things easier had you caught them and had you paid attention to them. And whether that's across the business, no one has headspace for that. Whether you have people who are meant to be looking at the strategy and the operations kind of management, but are just getting drawn into the fighting fires and dealing with the day-to-day, again, a sign that your structure isn't set up to resources people for success. Now, plenty of people dread the thought of recruiting for reasons other than org design. It is definitely more of an art than a science, and finding someone who's going to be successful and not a dickhead in your business can be a bit of a challenge. But recruiting can be particularly difficult when it's not really clear what the priorities for this role would be. You perhaps don't have a good sense of what skills this role would need to succeed at those tasks or at those responsibilities. Potentially you have roles that are quite unique or quite kind of kinky and a bit odd, and so going to market to find someone who's as skilled in export management, HR, leadership and coaching, like that's a massively broad skill set. It would be hard to find someone who was capable in all those areas. If any of those ring true, it's a sign that the way that you've structured your jobs and your roles might not be the most effective. Again, to play on that example, if you are held hostage by employees who have really high specialist or really high institutional knowledge, and you worry about calling them out for being difficult people to work with, or for not meeting a particular requirement, or for just being kind of a pain to deal with on a day-to-day basis, if you're worried about tackling them because the thought of having to replace them is really uncomfortable, it's a sign that the way that you've set up your work and your skills required in a way that doesn't best serve the business. Second to last, sometimes you end up having to untangle awkward employment relationships. So this happens when we aren't leading from a strategic and task kind of led perspective. And this happens a bit in smaller businesses. You'll go to market, or maybe you'll be introduced to someone through a colleague or a friend, and they seem fantastic. They're switched on, they know the industry, they seem very capable, you've got good rapport with them, they feel like they'd be a person who could do good work. Maybe you don't have a sense of what that good work is, but never mind, they're amazing. I'm sure they'll fit into the business, no stress. And so if you bring them into the business without a clear sense of what they're going to be delivering or responsible for, potentially in a few months' time, you may need to make them redundant, or you might need to move them on, not because there's anything wrong with them. They're not, unskilled or unmotivated or disengaged, but perhaps you need to spend your resources elsewhere and you didn't clock it before you hired them. Or potentially it becomes clear that what they're good at delivering and what they're really useful for is not work that you need right now. Maybe you're too big or too small, maybe you're just not quite ready for their level of expertise yet, but you end up potentially having to untangle a relationship that could have worked really well in other circumstances because you didn't spend the time to think about what work they were going to be doing, why it mattered, and how it connected to your strategic goals and therefore what you're trying to achieve. Lastly, again, if your expenditure on temps and contractors is very high, potentially that's a sign that you don't have your structure quite right. Maybe you don't have the skills that you need in-house, so you have to keep going out and paying a premium for them. Or if you're spending a lot on temps to kind of replace turnover, again, a sign that your structure isn't supporting the needs of your employees and you're having to deal with higher churn as a result. So there's obviously a lot that can be driving all of these examples, but org design shows up more often than not because the way that you have set up what's important, what work is being done and who's doing it isn't serving the needs of the organisation or the people who work there. So if we want to put some time and attention into our organisational design, where do we start? And the first thing that I will say is that strategy leads always in this context. It's really important to begin at the top and to work your way down. It's unusual, I think, to hear an HR person say people come last, but in this circumstance, people really do. It needs to be clear what you're trying to achieve, what work happens, how you're organising that work before you start thinking about which bums you're going to put on those seats. So let's work through it. Start off with your strategy. What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? Do you have a 1-year plan? Do you have a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan? What choices have you made about achieving those goals? If you're planning to increase your revenue, are you going to do that by going after new customers, or are you going to try and upsell to your existing customers? Because those choices will influence the work that has to get done and therefore the people that you have to hire. So make sure you have a clear understanding of your strategy or your plan and the choices that you've made about how you're going to achieve those goals or those outcomes. Because that then flows nicely into tasks. What needs to happen to achieve your goals? What tasks need to be done? If you're launching into a new market, what has to happen for that to be reasonable and for that to take place? If you're planning on refocusing your business instead of doing design and build in the construction space, you're just going to do build, what tasks need to happen now to make the same amount of revenue from a reduced base of work, I guess. So once you know what you're trying to achieve, what has to happen in order to achieve that becomes a lot clearer. And then you can start grouping that into roles. So how does it make sense to group these tasks and activities? What's a reasonable workload? Do I want to have my accounts receivable function sitting with the same person with the same role who does our employment documents and our HR, also be sitting with the person who's responsible for marketing and for our comms out to our customers? That's a massively wide skill set. It would be really hard to find someone who is capable and competent in all of those areas. And also that'll split their focus quite significantly. And they're going to end up with a pretty chunky workload that is potentially not going to be sustainable for one person to manage. So once you know what tasks you have, you can then start grouping them into jobs to see whether it makes sense to have, one accounts receivable person, one HR person, one salesperson, or maybe 3 people who kind of sit across all of that, or 2.5 people. But once you know what work needs to happen, you can group it into a job that you can go to market for and make sure is kind of reasonable for one person to do. This is when we come to talking about people last, as I promised. So knowing what jobs you have and what buckets of tasks sit in those jobs, you can then much more intelligently go to market and try and find those people. If you need someone in your accounts receivable or your finance function who's process-oriented and methodical and very good at doing the same thing month in and month out, you can now recruit for that person. Potentially, if you're looking on the marketing side of things, you need someone who's process-oriented but quite creative, has experience kind of launching into new markets and creating collateral and creative and assets for that. That's going to require someone with a different orientation than it does for someone who's going to be sitting in your finance team. It sounds really trite to say that you're going to need different skills and different people for different roles. But once you've got the roles clear, you can then go about finding the people who are most likely to succeed. So STRAP, of course, is strategy, tasks, roles, and people. That's where that acronym comes from. So we're going to work through a few examples now, and then we'll jump into bonus resources and then have time for questions. If there's something that's come to mind as I'm talking through this or something you'd like me to speak to in more detail, pop in the Q&A function. I will be taking them at the end, or if you'd like to hold your questions until we're finished and pop them through then, that's totally fine as well. It's up to you. So we're dealing with a growth scenario here in our first example. Lisa owns an accounting business and she wants to grow her revenue from 3 million to 5 million over the next 2 years. So Lisa's got some pretty ambitious goals to grow her business by 60%. Her strategy is that she's decided it would be reasonable to her to aim for 750,000 of new revenue in this financial year and 1.25 million of new revenue in the financial year ending 26. So that's what she's aiming for. And she's decided to achieve this increase in revenue by growing her client base. She's not going to try and maximize the amount of revenue she can get out of her existing customers. It doesn't fit her business model. She needs to be servicing more customers to bring that amount of revenue. So in terms of tasks, she knows that is now going to lead to an increase in marketing and sales activity. She's bringing on new customers, right? So she needs to make people aware of her business and have sales processes in place to convert them into paying customers. And she also knows that if she's increasing her client base, she's going to have to increase her client services, or that will lead to an increase in the workload that her accountants and her assistant accountants deliver. So she's going to have to increase the number of people servicing the customers that she has. Now, if we focus just on the sales tasks rather than trying to, go through a whole bunch of different decision trees, her long-standing BDM brings in 250,000 of new revenue each year. And because her clients sign up on a retainer, once they've brought a customer in, that revenue repeats into the years following unless they churn. So her long-standing BDM brings in 250 grand of new revenue a year. So she's going to use that as a figure to calculate how many new people she might need to have in place to deliver the revenue goal she set for herself. So in order to bring in 750,000 of new revenue this financial year, she's going to need her existing BDM, who brings in the first 250, and then to get the next $500,000, she's going to need 2 new BDMs. So she's growing her team from 1 to 3, and she's adding 2 new BDMs in that financial year. The year after, she's going to want to add another $550,000 of revenue. So the 750 that those BDMs have brought on, and then another 500,000 to take you to the 125. So from her team of 3 BDMs who can bring in 750 a year, she then needs to add 2 more BDMs to take her annual growth in revenue to 1.25 million. So she's going to end up with a team of 5 BDMs, each bringing in $250,000 a year to hit that 1.25 mark in the financial year ending 26. In terms of people, now that she knows what role she needs, she's not going to worry about bringing in like a junior sales assistant. She knows she needs more senior BDMs. So she's going to spend a bit of time understanding what makes her current BDM successful. Then she's going to put together a job description, interview questions, and go out to market and recruit. So a reasonably tactical example, right? There's a pretty linear relationship between how much revenue she wants and the BDM she's going to need to bring in. But just in terms of being clear that she had a strategy first, she knows that that's going to mean an increase in activity, which means an increase in sales team, and then she can go out and find the people. That's where your flow sits. Growth's a pretty typical one. Let's look at an example where we're talking about change. So Aroha owns a B2C wearable tech company that developed 3 key products. Sales of product B took off in 2018, and Aroha's company now exports to 2 countries, which is very exciting. So the strategy now is to support the existing customers of product B. That's the product that the market responded best to. It's the one where most of their sales come from. So they want to make sure that they're retaining those customers. And so putting time into supporting them is a sensible choice. They also want to export to 2 new countries by financial year 2026. So support existing customers and get new ones is their strategy, which means they're going to be having some changes to the tasks and the work that happens. They're choosing to discontinue products A and C. So remember, the company developed 3 key products, but only company B took off. So in order to have the resources and attention to pursue their increased amount of support and their increased amount of export growth, they're going to discontinue the other 2 products because they kind of can't do everything and be all things to all people. In terms of what that does to the tasks, they know that they're going to have to do some market research to figure out which are the next 2 countries they're going to export to. They need to do a bunch of research here. They don't know whether it's best to target North America, South America, parts of Europe, parts of Asia. They need to do some research to understand where they're going to be aiming for. They also know they're going to need to find a new distribution partner or partners because they are manufacturers. They have partners who sell for them in the export country. So they're going to need to find a new distribution partner to help them kind of with their export goals. And they know that they're going to be reducing the R&D and support for products A and C. If they're discontinuing those products and not pursuing them, then the kind of support and work needed to maintain them and to investigate and create new products is going to be reduced. What this means for the roles is that they are going to create a new global market development lead position who's responsible for the market research and finding distribution partners. That makes sense. They're also going to be disestablishing the research and development teams for products A and C. Those products didn't take off. They didn't get a good response to them. Sales are pretty low. So they've decided to discontinue them, which means that, of course, the people working on those projects, on those products are not going to have roles. What this means for people is they're going to run a restructure for the R&D teams to reduce those roles down. Potentially, they'll be able to redeploy them into the team for product B if there are vacancies, but if not, it will be redundancy. And they're going to go to market for this new role to bring those skills to manage kind of an export and a growth plan and finding distribution partners and deal with everything that comes with exporting. So the strategy was to pursue one product. That means that they have a whole bunch of new work because they're going into new markets. It's reducing the work required to support the products they're discontinuing, which means the roles are going to go and also the people that they have in those roles are going to change while resourcing for this new skill set that they need. Last example here, and this is the one when we're talking about a challenge, certainly one that is pulled from real life living in Tamaki Makaurau in Auckland, if any of you have been to the CBD recently. So Jacques owns a boutique retail store in a big city. A large infrastructure project has reduced foot traffic and in-person sales are down by 50%. Pretty clearly, his strategy is going to need to be outlast the project, just make it through this period of reduced foot traffic. And in order to do that, he's going to have to reduce his cost by 30% because his in-person sales are down by 50%. What we know is that fewer customers means less work on the floor, but also, interestingly, online orders have increased 25%. So Jacques has some pretty loyal customers, but they can't be bothered sort of dealing with the hassle and bustle of getting into the city anymore. So they're ordering from him online instead. Sales are still down, but there is a bit of a lift in his online activity because people can't make it into the shop in person anymore. So Jacques run the numbers. He knows he's going to reduce his retail staff from 5 FTE to 3 FTE. That'll drop his costs by 40% to get there, going from 5 to 3. But what he's going to do is he's going to create a 0.5 FTE e-commerce manager. This is a new role for the business, but online orders have increased enough that he can justify having someone who just looks after receiving orders, communicating with customers, managing warehousing and picking and dispatch, and kind of dealing with any feedback that comes through once they've shipped the products out to their customers. So what that means for the people is he's going to restructure his retail staff. He's going to use a skills matrix to decide who of the 5 are going to stay for those 3 remaining roles, assuming all of them express interest. But also he's going to be able to redeploy one of his staff into this new role if they're interested in the opportunity and if they have the skills. Obviously going from 1 FTE to 0.5 FTE is going to be a change, but he does have an opportunity to offer them if it's something one of his existing team would be keen on. Otherwise he'll go to market to replace the role. The math of that works out to mean that he is going to make one person redundant because he doesn't have enough roles for everyone, unfortunately. Revenue is still down. So again, strategy, survive at this point. The reduction in customers means a bunch of tasks and work has been reduced, which flows through quite nicely into obviously your roles being shrunk and you're reducing your people. But as a part of this challenge, there has been an uptick in his online sales, and so he's able to create a role that focuses solely on fulfilling those orders, and then that gives him some opportunities and some wiggle room to move his people around. Whatever change you're experiencing, whether it's growth, whether it's just a change, whether it's a challenge, it's really important to take the time to be responsive to what's happening. So oftentimes when we're under pressure, business owners and managers are overwhelmed. Most of the time we'll have a lot on our plates. It's really easy to leap to a solution and just try and deal with the problem and make it go away, rather than sometimes taking a bit of time to understand what's going to be best and where the changes are that'll make the most impact. So when you are navigating change, a few questions to ask just to give you a sense of how you might be able to proactively manage your org design in response to these challenges. Starts with, are there enough doing roles to meet our customers' needs? Whether it's baristas, mechanics, lawyers, hairdressers, do we have enough people actually on the ground delivering what it is our customers pay for? Because if we don't, those doers are going to get overloaded, their workload's going to become imbalanced, customers get dissatisfied, and obviously that contributes to reduced customer satisfaction and business outcomes over time. Are there enough coordinating roles to make sure work happens consistently and effectively? Especially as you get larger, it's amazing how quickly the founder or the business owner loses touch with exactly what is happening in every person's workload on a day-to-day basis. When you're thinking about team leaders, quality managers, coordinators, whoever it is responsible for coordinating your workload and making sure everything's running smoothly, take the time to make sure it's clear who's responsible for that, because it is work. We like to think that we can all just show up and charge ahead and get things done. Often we can, but there is a lot of work that goes into coordinating the work that happens to make sure that our doers can be doing most of the time rather than being pulled out of their day-to-day work to deal with the admin and the coordination of making things happen across the business. Next, make sure there are enough supporting roles to make your business run smoothly. So finance, HR, marketing, sales, all of these supporting functions, office management, facilities management, all of that kind of stuff, is there to make sure the business runs smoothly and you don't kind of hit operational or compliance sort of headaches as you move along. This type of work in a small organization typically sits with sort of your management or your business managers wear lots of different hats, but make sure you have accounted for that work and those functions, because if you don't, again, you're going to run into headaches later down the line. Lastly, are there enough thinking and leading roles to make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction? So your GM, your regional managers, your chief executives, your founder, your CEO, all of these roles are about thinking and anticipating and responding and setting the tone and the direction of the organization. Again, if you don't have the time or the role or the accounting for the fact that this has to happen, you will just end up doing the same thing quarter in, quarter out, year in, year out. And that can be fine if your industry isn't subject to change or if your customer base doesn't change and you aren't subject to some of the pressures that we're seeing earlier. So make sure you've got enough doing roles or enough doing work, enough coordinating and enough supporting, and lastly, enough thinking and leading to make sure that everyone's pulling in the same direction and you're all getting better and kind of responding to the challenges that you're facing on a month-to-month basis. So that was all in terms of formal content today, and we're sitting at 22, which is perfect. That gives us about 10 minutes for questions. Just to let you know that we're going to be sharing some bonus resources with you in the follow-up email you receive after this webinar. So the first is the webinar recording. If you've come to our sessions before, you know that we'd like to record our sessions and make sure that they're available. So a link to that will be in your email. I've also written a workbook, which I'll pull up in a second and show you, that you might like to take away if this is something you're investigating. It goes through the STRAP approach in much more detail. It gives you questions and prompts to ask and answer about how your business is doing. So if you would like a resource to dive into this in a bit more detail, again, that link will be there later on. And we are trying something a bit different today. So as part of your attendance today, you are welcome to take us up on a complimentary 20-minute consultation with me about org design questions, anything that's happening in your business related to change, even if you just want 20 minutes to bounce some ideas off someone and have a conversation. So that is a link to go to book some time in my calendar. The link will also be in the follow-up email afterwards. But if this has been an interesting taster, and if you'd like to have a more personal or a more a more tailored conversation about whatever you're navigating, please do book in that 20 minutes. Again, it's complimentary. It gives us a chance to get to know each other. And if there's something that I think where we can add some value or be helpful, then I might refer you onto our sales team. But it's not a hard sell. It's very much just a session to say hello and to add some value to you. So that is all from me. I will just quickly show you this resource to give you a sense of what's coming your way and to make sure that you are happy with it. I'll just pull it up. Bear with me. I've been in my Word docs a lot today, so I'm just making sure I'm pulling up the right one. Cool. And what I'm hoping that will show you, as I just share my screen again to make sure I'm showing you the right thing. Cool. So that document is going to look like this. So it's a participant's workbook. It's the strategy lead sort of approach. And as you work through, it gives you a chance to respond to a bunch of statements based on how you think your business is going. So do you have a documented organizational strategy? Yep, I strongly agree that we do. Do we schedule time in our year to review, adjust, and plan our strategy? Do we measure progress and so on? And once we've worked through a bit of a reflective exercise, it then gives you some space to think about what can we do well when it comes to strategy, what do we need to pay attention to, what steps can we take, and so on. It's certainly a resource to get you thinking about the different aspects of org design and give you a bit of a space to think. I had a client I shared this with a little while ago who took it away from a workshop and actually used it to as part of a broader conversation they were having with their senior leadership team about the structure of the business. So the feedback was that it was very useful, which is always pleasing. We like preparing stuff that's going to be helpful for you. So if it's something you're interested in, again, that will be in the email that follows. So that is all from me. I will jump into questions to see what is coming through. I'm happy to stick around until 2, so if you'd like to wrap up and head off, thank you again for joining us. But if you'd like to stick around for Q&A, I'll start jumping through and answering questions now. So now's the chance to submit. So Anonymous, kia ora Anonymous, thank you for joining. Says, kia ora, our recent problem identification workshops have led to recognising that it's our interface and or collaboration between internal departments that's causing the biggest issues. So from a design perspective, I think we need to strengthen our seams. How would you suggest scoping the solution to break down those silos? That is a fabulous question, very well articulated, so thank you for putting the time together. Dealing with silos and inter-team collaboration can be incredibly difficult, and that the correct answer will depend a lot on your context. So broadly, I would say that you might want to take a design-led approach to resolving your challenges. And the first thing to do is it's going to get messy before it gets cleaner, so don't let that freak you out. But really sit down and understand, where are some of the examples where this communication has broken down? Has that led to missed things that were important to customer delivery, or has it meant that we've been slower to respond to opportunities? Really nut out and spend time with the people in those departments, understanding what it is that is happening, because what you think is happening, what actually is going down, can often be two quite different things. So you're going to just have to get a bit messy and figure out actually what is breaking down and what are the issues here and what are the outcomes, so that you get a clear picture of kind of what is happening. Once you've done that sort of discovery work, you're then going to refine what it is that you're looking at to understand what the issues are. So one of the issues might be that there is no cadence, or there is no regular set point for your teams to coordinate and talk to each other. And perhaps the management expectation, for example, is that your teams will just proactively have a chat and connect with each other when there's something that is going on in their world that they know affects the other team. That very rarely happens. It's much more common that in order for there to be effective inter-team collaboration, that there has to be set whips maybe every week or every fortnight, or there is a particular Slack channel where kind of initiatives are shared and there's discussion going on. But often you will have to force your people to talk to each other, not that they don't want to, but they don't have the perspective to understand when what they're working on might affect what's happening in someone else's world. So perhaps there is something around regular cadences to book in those meetings and conversations. Potentially it's maybe there's some interpersonal conflict. You know, maybe there are relationships or dynamics there which mean that people in team A just we're going to hate dealing with people from team B, and so maybe the cadences and the meetings are there, but they just hate talking to each other, and so they're not going to deal with each other. That obviously requires a different solution, a different response than we don't know when to talk to each other. If the problem is we dislike each other, that's going to require something different, but you don't know what's required until you've kind of discovered what's going on and actually refined it to understand what the driver of the issue is. Once you've done your kind of discovery piece, you then need to start thinking about solutions, right? And so that's likely to involve some workshops with people from each team. I would suggest that you spend a bit of time with kind of key stakeholders or key people talking through some of the solutions. And then you're just going to have to try some stuff and see if it works. So potentially that might mean that you try something for the month of June. At the end of June, you do a bit of a retro and see if it works. Potentially then in July, you'll try something different, but there's likely to be a period of iterative solution testing to see what makes a difference. If you are interested in learning more about that approach, I'd recommend Googling the double diamond, like a design-led approach to problem solving. If you Google double diamond, there's heaps of resources out there. There's certainly stuff that I've been using internally with MyHR as we've been navigating some new L&D work we're doing with our teams. So get messy before it gets cleaner, understand what the actual issue is, start thinking and talking and consulting about solutions and changes, and then just start iterating and trying them as you move through with my best response. I hope that was useful. That felt like a long answer from me, so please rewatch it if you need to catch anything in there, but best of luck and I hope it goes well for you. Anonymous asks, good Anonymous, thanks for coming along. Can I recommend a ratio of doing roles versus leading, supporting, coordinating? Yeah, that's a magic question. I would be a millionaire if I could. I think start with your strategy, because your strategy is going to inform what the tasks are that need to happen, and therefore what roles you need and what people you need. What I mean by that is, if you have a service, say you're a law firm, and you are really, really used to delivering great legal advice to your clients and your customers at pace, you've had a team that's been with you for 5+ years, everyone's got a lot of tenure under their belt, and so maybe you don't actually need that much coordinating work, because everyone kind of knows what to do. They've got a stable of clients they deal with. There isn't a lot of change. So maybe for every, I'm pulling a number off the top of my head here, but maybe for every 10 lawyers, you might need one practice manager to kind of make sure that everything's coordinated, billing is happening, all that kind of stuff. If you then were to say, hey, everyone, there have been massive strides in the artificial intelligence field, and we are now going to be using this amazing legal chatbot AI tool, and that's going to mean there are a whole bunch of different ways of working. We're introducing a new CRM, a new customer relationship management tool, and so your legal team are now a bit unbalanced, right? Because they're dealing with a new technical tool like this legal chat robot. They're also dealing with a new way of tracking and communicating with customers. They're no longer dealing with emails and letters. It's all sitting in your CRM. You might need to double the number of coordinating roles because your doing team are now a bit off balance, and it's going to be harder for them to coordinate and make sure that what they're doing matches what everyone else in the team is doing because there's been so much change. So that's one example where you might want to maybe permanently or temporarily increase your coordinating roles because there is a genuine need for it because more coordination has to happen than in the past. In terms of a ratio, it's really hard to answer that because every context is so specific. But generally, if you have more change happening or a more complex product or service you're delivering, the more coordinating roles you will need. And certainly the larger the business gets, the more of those coordinating and supervising roles. In terms of leadership, again, sort of depends a bit on size, but go back to your strategy, figure out what you're trying to achieve and the choices you've made about how you achieve that. From there will flow what work has to happen, how you might group that into roles, and then the types of people that you might need to hire those roles. Patty says, Patty here, that was great, clear and relevant. Oh, good, Patty. Love getting live feedback. Thank you. Welcome to the next. It's good to find out more about MyHR as well. Thank you. You are super welcome, Patty. Anytime you're welcome to get in touch as well if you'd like to take us up on that free consultation. Pam says, often in SME management is seen to be both the planners and thinkers as well as having a business as usual task-based role. Any strategies to make this more balanced? That is the absolute nub of, Pam, why working in small and medium businesses is so much fun, as well as being some of the toughest jobs around. It can be very difficult for anyone to sort of switch gears between the doing of the doing and the planning of the doing, and then the thinking about the planning of the doing. That's a lot of ground you're asking someone to cover, as well as being responsible for delivering to your external customers, your internal customers. One of the tools that you might find it helpful to engage with is to look at, as much as you can, separating your thinking from your planning and coordinating from your doing, and that might be quarterly leadership or quarterly or monthly leadership meetings where all of the strategic big picture thinking is happening and you make decisions, and then you've resolved that for the next month or the next quarter or the next 6 months, whatever makes sense in your context. And so then for the rest of the quarter or the month or the year, you're just focusing on the coordinating and the doing rather than having to be strategic and tactical and kind of on the tools at the same time. Anything where you can separate the planning from the doing is helpful. Maybe that's sitting with your team and figuring out what process works for them. That might be, at the start of every week, they spend 3 hours on a Monday planning out their week and figuring out what happens, and then Monday afternoon onwards is just about executing. Maybe it's that they have to book in an hour every morning to see what's been going on, and then the rest of the day can be delivery. There are ways that you can split and kind of what's the phrase? So task bucketing or task grouping. Basically, you try and get as much of work that is similar to happen at the same time in the day or as part of the same set of tasks, so that you're not going strategy meeting in 1 hour, next you're delivering some customer stuff, in the afternoon you're planning the next week, in the afternoon you're back to strategy. Like anything that's too late, that is going to be incredibly draining on our brains because of all the task switching costs that we're having to make during the day. So anything where you can bucket it and sort of make it a bit more sensible is going to be useful. Ultimately, in small businesses, it is somewhat inevitable that we are going to have to be across the strategy and the tactics and the doing of the doing. So part of that's just inherent in the way that our businesses operate, but there are definitely organisational and time management and scheduling tools you can use to make that a bit less overwhelming and to make it a bit more organised and structured in terms of how you tackle those different needs. Tracy asks, kia ora Tracy, thank you for coming along. As your organisation grows, what are some strategies you can recommend for ensuring lines of communication are strong between the thinkers, coordinators and support roles, and to enable the coordinators and supporters to have input? That's a great question. People who are on the ground often have the best range of solutions to a particular problem. So they are used to this issue with the product that they're making, kind of always having this widget bit that needs replaced. Or they are the clearest that the way that dispatch is handled slows things down and it takes a long time to get things off the shop floor into dispatch to customers. So your people on the ground have really, really excellent understanding of the problems and will often have a pretty broad range of things that they think would help. What they are missing is the perspective and context to know what else is happening in the business, and sometimes the creativity or the brain space or the training to think of outside of the box solutions beyond just what immediately would solve their problem. So totally agree that having those lines of communication are strong. Really, it comes down to putting the time and the effort into bringing them into the decision-making room. Business is not a democracy. We don't all get a vote, but we should all have a voice in decisions that are being made about our work and how things are handled, because everyone will have a perspective that either validates what you thought was a sensible choice, maybe gives you some different options to consider, or maybe gives you some different tools that you might not have considered using before. So really put the time into talking to everyone, make sure the right people are in the room so those choices are being made, potentially formalize some of your process improvement or some of your kind of planning and scheduling meetings. If that just happens ad hoc at the moment, it can be a bit stink to be someone on the floor who's going, oh, I kind of would have liked to have had input into that, but if that decision happened at a water cooler when I wasn't aware it was happening, like they've missed out on the chance to contribute. That can feel a bit isolating or a bit exclusive. So make sure the talking and the time happens. Formalize your kind of meetings and conversations if you can. And beyond that, just test and try a bunch of things and see what helps those people feel included, but also what leads to better outcomes for the business. I've got a question here from Anonymous. I think the question when I registered for the webinar regarding returning a 100% remote work from home employee to the office. Do I have that question on record? I don't. I don't have any pre-webinar questions sitting here, I'm sorry. If you'd like to flick that question through again now, I can answer it if we have time. Otherwise, again, you're welcome to book that free complimentary 20-minute session with me post-webinar if you'd like to have a conversation about that more directly. So send it through here or book a session with me. Janet asks, there are many employers who tell workers that they'll credit their payments into their bank account. However, the worker does not know how the amounts were worked out. What can the worker do? For employers, they just treat the payments as casual pay, but without details and no percent added pay. This looks dodgy. What's your view, please? Janet, that is a question that might be better taken offline, just because it's a bit removed from the context of this webinar that we're having today. What I can say broadly is that employers should be providing pay slips to their employees, which it sounds like it's happening, and the pay slip should clearly state what their gross pay was, what the PAYE tax contribution was, what the child support, KiwiSaver, student loan, any of that kind of stuff. And if the employee is a fixed term worker of under 12 months, or if they're a casual employee, there needs to be an 8% loading kind of identified at the top of that pay slip. So if that isn't happening, definitely a practice for the employer to investigate and put into place. And again, if you'd like to have a more in-depth conversation, book in that 20-minute session with me when that email comes out post-webinar. Question from Sean. Hey, Sean, how are you doing? Nice to see you in this context. Sean and I know each other outside of work, so it's always a bit of a joy when he pops up here. So Sean says, we're hiring a few people at the moment and are very aware that the specific roles and responsibilities will change as our startup grows from 5 to 15 to 50, hopefully. Do I have any suggestions about how to clearly articulate that roles are likely to change and not to be precious or territorial? At this point, we need the company to grow rather than the specific role to grow. It hasn't been a problem so far, but I'm aware that this has the potential to be an issue in the future and or with current hires. Yeah, good point. To me, it sounds like two things may need to happen. The first is that you may need to be informally setting some of those expectations on a person-to-person basis. So that might be that during the recruitment process, you make it clear that the context of your business is that you're a startup, which I'm sure you do already, and to be really clear that part of the opportunity here is for these roles and kind of work to expand over time, but that the person will need to be comfortable with that. Some questions you might ask during your recruitment process would be, tell us about a time that you've experienced change to your workload or your responsibilities at work What was the context? How did you respond? How did you handle that? You might also like to ask, tell us about a time where you had to navigate some ambiguity at work. What happened? How did you approach that? And what was the outcome of that situation? So you're testing them a little bit to make sure that they are actually going to be comfortable and not throw a bit of a hissy fit. Once they're on board, again, kind of having those regular conversations, basically whatever you need to do to keep it front of mind that the business is growing and therefore the work is growing and evolving as you get there. The second thing to remember is that in your employment agreement, which is your legal document between you and your staff, you do have to include a description of the work to be performed. That's a legal requirement that you can't skip. So it sounds like there's a cultural piece around, hey, heads up, this is all going to be changing and moving. We think it's exciting, but we need you to be a bit flexible and be prepared to change. As part of that, then on the compliance side of things, it might be worth maybe every 6 months if you're moving really quickly, but at least every year or 18 months, booking in a half day to review all of your employment agreements and job descriptions and update them if you need to. One example of that might be if you had a team supervisor who was, supervising a production line, if they now have responsibilities for quality assurance and maybe collaborating and connecting in with your dispatch team that didn't exist a year ago, their job title might still be supervisor or production supervisor, but there needs to be a section added to their JD about those quality assurance or those kind of collaboration activities that weren't there before. So what sounds like will happen, totally fine, part of the life of being in a startup. Make sure you manage people's expectations so you don't get people being disgruntled or upset. And then on the compliance side of things, just make sure that you're ticking over and have a review process in place to make sure that your documents and kind of what's in the agreement between you and your team reflects what's happening in reality. Simone says, "Kia ora, Simone, thank you for coming along. Our business is not big enough to have separate roles such as HR, finance, sales, compliance, and so on. How do we best design those blended roles?" Totally fair, Simone. Most businesses under kind of 40, which is a lot of businesses in New Zealand, don't have the size to have separate functions for those roles. So it comes down a little bit to what other work is happening and where it makes sense to pair that work. For example, if you're a smaller organization, your managing director or your CEO might have to hold the HR responsibilities because it's not appropriate for anyone else in the business to have access to like everyone's employment records and everyone's pay records. So maybe some of that sits with your CEO. Maybe you have someone in a business management role who has experience in finance or who has experience with accounting. Perhaps it makes sense to group the tasks into their role, partly because, their role, it makes sense for their role, but a little bit because you are a bit limited in terms of the skills that you have in the business. So this would be the one time where I would say, who you have sitting in the role makes a bit of sense. Of course, it does leave you a bit vulnerable if that person goes and suddenly you're looking for a tour guide who has financial management. That might be hard to find, but you do need to figure out kind of where that all sits. One option is just to outsource it. Like if you go and pay an accountant to do all this work for you, or if you're engaged in an outsourced HR function like MyHR, we bring a bunch of that skill and experience without having to sit it within particular roles. So it depends a bit on your strategy, it depends a bit on what the work is happening, and it depends a bit on your willingness to engage with outsourcing those particular functions. That brings us to the end of the Q&A. Those were some fabulous questions. Thank you so much for taking the time to submit them. We will wrap up. We are just after 2, so I will let you go back into your days. Again, thank you so much for joining us. You will get a follow-up email with recording of the webinar, that bonus resource to work through, and the link to book in a time with me if you'd like to have a longer conversation. Otherwise, have a wonderful day and a wonderful rest of your week, and I look forward to seeing you next time. Ka kite.